Paris, September 16th, 1977. The housekeeper arrives at the apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel just after noon. She uses her key. Inside, the curtains are drawn. Maria Callas is lying on the floor of her bedroom, still wearing the clothing from the day before. She is 53 years old. The autopsy will determine heart failure, but the pharmaceutical bottles scattered across her nightstand suggest a longer, slower process. The woman who once held 3,000 people silent with a single note died alone in a room where no one had visited in weeks. This was not the death of a recluse who had retreated from the world. Callas had wanted to be seen. She had spent decades constructing a public image, the diva, the goddess, the voice of the century. But the architecture of fame had required materials she did not possess: the right family, the right body, the right emotional detachment. What she built instead was a performance so total it consumed the performer. By the end, there was no separation between Maria Callas and the role she inhabited. The woman underneath had been used up. Wealth came. So did adoration, monuments, historical recordings that would outlive everyone who heard them. But none of it answered the question she had been asking since childhood: whether she was enough. The applause was never loud enough. The love was always conditional. And the voice, the instrument that gave her everything, demanded a price she would spend 30 years paying. This is what remains when the curtain falls. Maria was born in New York City in December 1923, 3 months after her parents arrived from Greece. Her mother, Evangelia, had wanted a son. She said this openly, to Maria's face, throughout her childhood. The girl who arrived instead carried the disappointment like a birth defect. Her father, George, worked at a pharmacy and came home late. Her older sister, Jackie, was prettier, easier, the one who fit naturally into rooms. Maria learned early that love was not distributed equally. Evangelia had trained as a pianist in Athens, but had never performed professionally. She married George Kalogeropoulos when she was 21, and the marriage functioned as a kind of burial. She brought that bitterness to America. When she discovered that Maria could sing, really sing, not the casual singing of children, but something technically unusual, she saw an opportunity for correction. If Evangelia could not have the career she wanted, her daughter would have it for her. Maria was 8 years old when the lessons began in earnest. The training was not gentle. Evangelia enrolled Maria in singing classes that were designed for teenagers, not children. She forced her to practice for hours after school while other children played outside. When Maria's voice tired, Evangelia accused her of laziness. When Maria cried, Evangelia told her that greatness required suffering. The logic was airtight. If you are in pain, you are improving. If you are not in pain, you are wasting time. Maria learned to measure her worth by how much she could endure. At 10, Maria was performing at Greek community events in New York, standing on stages in church basements and social clubs. Evangelia collected the small payments and praise. She began telling people that Maria would be famous, that she was training a future star. The girl herself was heavyset, awkward, nearsighted. She wore thick glasses that magnified her eyes. Other children mocked her. Evangelia told her that beauty didn't matter if you could sing, but the way she said it made clear that beauty did matter. It mattered enormously, and Maria's lack of it was one more disappointment to be overcome through labor. In 1937, when Maria was 13, Evangelia made a decision. She took Maria and Jackie back to Greece, leaving George behind in New York. The marriage had been disintegrating for years, and Evangelia wanted to escape it. But she also wanted to enroll Maria in the Athens Conservatoire, where serious training was possible. George sent money when he could. It was never enough. Evangelia resented him for it, and she made sure Maria knew that every meal, every lesson, every piece of clothing was paid for by sacrifice. Athens was not an improvement. Evangelia rented a small apartment and worked intermittently, but the household was always on the edge of financial collapse. She began using Maria's voice as currency. She arranged auditions, pushed her into competitions, negotiated payments for performances. By the time Maria was 15, she was singing professionally, not in major venues, but in cafes, at private parties, anywhere that paid. Evangelia kept the money. Maria kept singing. The training intensified under Elvira de Hidalgo, a Spanish soprano who had retired to Athens. De Hidalgo recognized that Maria had an unusual voice, enormous range, strange dark coloring in the lower register, a capacity for dramatic intensity that most sopranos could not access. But she also recognized that the girl was being destroyed by her mother. De Hidalgo tried to intervene, gently. She told Evangelia that Maria needed rest, that the schedule was too demanding for a teenager. Evangelia ignored her. Maria was 16 and performing nearly every week. The war came in 1940. German occupation turned Athens into a city of starvation and curfews. Evangelia's financial situation worsened. She relied even more heavily on Maria's performances, which now took place in theaters controlled by Italian and German officers. Maria sang for occupying soldiers because her mother needed the money. Years later, this would be used against her. The accusation that she had collaborated, that she had been complicit. But at the time, she was a teenager doing what her mother demanded. Refusal was not possible. The hunger was constant. Evangelia traded what little they had for food. Maria's weight dropped. Her body, which had been heavy throughout childhood, became thin in a way that was not healthy. She fainted during rehearsals. De Hidalgo brought her food when she could, but it was never enough. Maria kept singing. Her voice somehow did not fail. It grew stronger. She learned that the body could be starved and still produce sound, that suffering did not always destroy the instrument. Sometimes it sharpened it. By 1945, the war was over, but Maria's relationship with her mother had calcified into something transactional. Evangelia saw her as an investment. Maria saw her as an obligation. There was no affection left, only the mechanics of survival. Jackie had married and moved away. George was still in New York, estranged. Maria was 21 and had been performing for more than a decade, but she had no money, no independence, no life that was not dictated by Evangelia's ambitions. She made a decision. In September 1945, Maria left Greece and returned to New York. She told Evangelia she was going to audition for the Metropolitan Opera, that she would send money once she was established. It was a lie. Maria had no intention of sending money. She wanted to escape. The boat trip took 2 weeks. She arrived in New York with almost nothing. A few dresses, her scores, the technical training that De Hidalgo had given her. George met her at the dock. He had aged badly. The pharmacy was gone. He was living in a small apartment and working irregular hours. He was happy to see her, but he could not support her. Maria auditioned for the Met. She auditioned for smaller companies. She was rejected repeatedly. Her voice was too unusual, her appearance too severe, her repertoire too ambitious. American opera in 1946 wanted lyric sopranos who looked like movie stars. Maria was not that. She took small roles in minor productions. She sang at weddings. She taught voice lessons to children. She lived with her father and felt the walls closing in. 2 years passed. She was 23 and going nowhere. Evangelia wrote letters demanding money. Maria did not respond. The silence between them hardened into permanence. When Maria finally left for Italy in 1947, accepting a contract in Verona that paid almost nothing, she did not tell her mother she was leaving. She simply went. Verona in 1947 was a city still rebuilding from the war. The opera house, the Arena di Verona, had survived the bombings, but the productions were modest, the budgets thin. Maria arrived in June with 2 suitcases and minimal Italian. She had been hired to sing La Gioconda, a role that required a heavy, dramatic voice. The fee was small. She took it because there was nothing else. Giovanni Battista Meneghini attended the performance. He was 52 years old, a wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune in construction materials, bricks, tiles, cement. He had never married. He collected art, attended opera religiously, and lived alone in a large house in Verona. He watched Maria sing and saw something he wanted. After the performance, he went backstage. He introduced himself. He asked if she needed anything. She said no, but her voice was uncertain. Meneghini was not a sophisticated man. He had money, but no aristocratic lineage, no social grace. What he had was persistence. He began attending all of Maria's performances. He sent flowers. He invited her to dinners at expensive restaurants. Maria, who had been eating poorly since arriving in Italy, accepted. The meals were the best she had eaten in years. Meneghini paid for everything and asked for nothing in return. Not yet. He learned quickly that Maria had no money, no agent, no one managing her career. She was living in a cheap pension and traveling to auditions on buses. Meneghini offered to help. He knew people in the opera world, not intimately, but enough to make introductions. He could arrange meetings, negotiate contracts. Maria hesitated. She had learned not to trust generosity, but she was 23 and exhausted, and Meneghini's offers came without visible strings. She agreed to let him make some calls. Within weeks, he had secured her auditions in Venice and Florence. The roles were better, the fees higher. Maria began to rely on him. He accompanied her to rehearsals, carried her scores, dealt with theater managers who tried to underpay her. He was useful. More than that, he was present. Maria had spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her voice. Meneghini wanted her voice to succeed, but he also wanted her. The distinction felt significant. By early 1948, Meneghini was managing her career entirely. He negotiated every contract, handled all correspondence, controlled her schedule. Maria, who had been managed by her mother for so long, slipped easily into being managed by him. The dynamic was familiar. He made decisions. She sang. But Meneghini was softer than Evangelia, more generous. He paid for her housing, her clothes, her meals. He asked only that she let him take care of everything. She did. In April 1949, Meneghini proposed marriage. They were in his house in Verona. Maria had been living there in a separate bedroom for several months. The proposal was not romantic. Meneghini explained that marriage would simplify things, legally, financially, professionally. As his wife, she would have access to his resources without question. He would dedicate himself entirely to her career. She would never have to worry about money again. He did not mention love, neither did she. Maria accepted. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in a small church in Verona. There were no guests, no family. Her father was not invited. Evangelia did not know it was happening. Maria wore a simple dress. Meneghini wore a suit. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. Afterward, they returned to his house. Nothing changed. They continued sleeping in separate bedrooms. The marriage was not sexual. Maria would later claim it had never been consummated. Meneghini would deny this, but vaguely, without detail. What is certain is that the relationship functioned as a business arrangement from the beginning. Maria needed financial security and career management. Meneghini needed purpose and the reflected glory of being married to a great artist. Both got what they wanted. Neither got intimacy. Meneghini's wealth allowed Maria to stop worrying about rent and food. She could focus entirely on singing, but the cost was isolation. Meneghini was obsessively controlling. He monitored her interactions with other singers, directors, conductors. He intercepted her mail. He decided which social events she could attend and which she could not. He told her it was protection, that people in the opera world were predatory, that they would exploit her if he was not vigilant. Maria believed him because it confirmed what she already suspected, that everyone wanted something from her. She had no friends. Meneghini discouraged friendships, especially with other women. He said they would be jealous, that they would spread rumors. Maria accepted this. She spent her time either rehearsing or at home with Meneghini, who talked endlessly about her career, her repertoire, her future. He kept detailed records of every performance, every review, every fee. He showed her the numbers constantly, reminding her of how much she was earning, how much he was investing. The message was clear. She owed him. By 1950, Maria's career was accelerating. She was singing at La Scala in Milan, at the Teatro di San Carlo in Naples, at the Royal Opera House in London. The roles were prestigious. Aida, Norma, Tosca. The reviews were extraordinary. Critics called her voice unprecedented, her dramatic instincts revolutionary. But offstage, she was entirely dependent on Meneghini. He negotiated every contract, collected every payment, controlled every lira. Maria had no bank account of her own. She had no money that Meneghini did not give her. She began to gain weight again. The starvation of her teenage years had ended, but now she was eating compulsively. Meneghini encouraged it. He liked taking her to expensive restaurants, ordering elaborate meals. Maria ate because the food was there, because it was one of the few pleasures available to her. By 1952, she weighed over 200 pounds. Photographs from this period show a woman who looked older than 28, her body heavy, her face puffy. The opera world began to whisper. Beautiful voice, but the appearance was a problem. Meneghini did not care about her weight. He cared about her voice, her career, the money she was generating. He scheduled more performances, longer tours. Maria sang constantly. She was exhausted, but she did not complain. Complaining would mean admitting that the arrangement was not working. And where else could she go? She had no money, no family, no friends, only Meneghini, and the stages he booked for her, and the applause that confirmed she was doing what she had been trained to do since childhood. In January 1953, Maria made a decision that would define the next phase of her career and accelerate her physical decline. She began losing weight. Not gradually through moderate diet and exercise, but drastically. Within 18 months, she lost nearly 80 pounds. The transformation was documented in photographs that shocked the opera world. The heavy woman who had sung Norma in 1952 was unrecognizable by 1954. The official story, the one Maria told interviewers for years, was that she had discovered a tapeworm. She claimed a doctor in Verona had diagnosed her and that the parasite had caused the weight loss naturally. It was a convenient lie. What actually happened was more deliberate. Maria starved herself. She ate almost nothing: black coffee, raw vegetables, occasionally lean meat. She took diuretics. She exercised obsessively. Meneghini watched and said nothing. The weight was falling off, and the world was noticing. The opera establishment responded immediately. Suddenly, Maria was not just a great voice, she was a spectacle. Magazine covers featured her new figure. Fashion houses offered to dress her. Social invitations increased. The same critics who had praised her singing but mentioned her weight apologetically now called her the most beautiful woman in opera. Maria absorbed this. She learned that her value had been conditional all along, that the voice alone had not been enough. Now she was thin, and the world loved her differently. But the weight loss damaged her voice. The body that produced sound was no longer the same instrument. Her breath support changed. The resonance in her lower register diminished. Certain high notes became precarious. Maria knew this. She could feel the difference every time she sang. But she continued the diet anyway because the alternative, returning to her previous weight, was unthinkable. She had seen how the world treated her when she was heavy. She would not go back. Meneghini encouraged the transformation, not out of concern for her appearance, but because it opened new opportunities. Wealthy collectors and socialites who had ignored Maria before now invited her to their homes. Theater directors who had hesitated to cast her in romantic roles suddenly saw possibilities. Maria was being admitted to spaces that had been closed to her. The cost was invisible to everyone except her. The vocal problems began appearing in 1954. During a performance of Medea in Dallas, Maria's voice cracked on a sustained high note. The audience gasped. She recovered, finished the aria, but the moment had been captured. Critics mentioned it in reviews cautiously. Meneghini dismissed it as fatigue. Maria said nothing publicly, but privately she was terrified. She increased her practice time, drilling scales and arpeggios for hours. She consulted vocal coaches who told her she was pushing too hard, that she needed rest. She ignored them. The schedule Meneghini had constructed for her was punishing. In 1954 alone, Maria sang 73 performances across 12 cities. She traveled constantly, Milan to London to Chicago to New York to Rome. There were no breaks between productions. She would finish a run of Traviata in one city and immediately begin rehearsals for Lucia in another. Her body existed in a state of permanent exhaustion. She slept poorly. She developed chronic insomnia that would plague her for the rest of her life. She began taking pills, first for sleep, barbiturates prescribed by doctors who asked no questions, then for energy, amphetamines to counteract the sedatives, then for nerves, tranquilizers before performances. By 1955, Maria's pharmaceutical routine was established. She could not sleep without pills. She could not wake without pills. She could not perform without pills. The drugs worked, but they worked by borrowing from the future. Every pill was a debt that would eventually come due. Her perfectionism intensified. Maria had always been demanding in rehearsals, but now she became tyrannical. She screamed at orchestra members who missed cues. She walked out of rehearsals if the staging was not exactly as she wanted. She demanded infinite takes during recording sessions, re-singing passages dozens of times to correct microscopic flaws that no one else could hear. Producers began to dread working with her, but they continued booking her because the performances, when they happened, were extraordinary. The vocal decline was not constant. There were still nights when Maria sang perfectly, when the voice did everything she asked, and the performance achieved the transcendence she was chasing. But those nights became less frequent. More often, she was managing limitations. She developed techniques to disguise vocal weaknesses, dramatic gestures that distracted from unstable notes, interpretive choices that avoided sustained high singing. She became a brilliant actress partly because she had to compensate for what the voice could no longer do reliably. In 1955, she returned to the Metropolitan Opera in New York for the first time since her failed auditions in 1946. The contract was prestigious, the fees substantial. Meneghini negotiated terms that reflected her new status, but the Met's general manager, Rudolph Bing, was unimpressed by Maria's demands. He had dealt with difficult sopranos before. He made clear that at the Met, no singer was larger than the institution. Maria arrived expecting to be treated as royalty. Bing treated her as an employee. The Met debut in Norma was vocally uneven. Maria's high notes were strained. She compensated with dramatic intensity, and the audience responded with prolonged ovations. But Bing's assistant made notes about the vocal problems. The administrative machinery of the Met began documenting what Maria was trying to hide, that the instrument was becoming unreliable, that the performances were sustained increasingly by willpower rather than technical security. Maria sang 8 performances at the Met that season. Each one was harder than the last. By the final performance, she was dosing herself with cortisone to reduce vocal inflammation. The drug helped temporarily, but it caused water retention. Her face became puffy. Her body began retaining the weight she had worked so desperately to lose. She increased the diuretics. The chemical management of her body was now a full-time project. Back in Italy, Meneghini scheduled more performances. Maria told him she needed rest. He showed her the financial records, how much they were earning, how much was being invested, how much they would need for the future. Maria looked at the numbers and agreed to the schedule. She could not afford to stop. Not financially, though Meneghini's wealth would have supported them both. She could not afford to stop because stopping meant confronting what the work was hiding, that she had no idea who she was when she was not singing. In 1954, Maria received an invitation to a party at the home of Countess Castelbarco in Milan. The Countess was connected to Italian aristocracy, and her gatherings attracted titled families, wealthy industrialists, and artists who had been absorbed into high society. Maria attended wearing a new gown purchased specifically for the occasion. She had lost enough weight by then to wear the kind of fitted, elegant clothing she had seen in magazines. Meneghini accompanied her, proud to display his wife in these circles. The evening was a failure. Maria spoke little, intimidated by the casual fluency with which the other guests discussed art, literature, politics. When she did speak, her accent marked her as foreign, her grammar uncertain. The women at the party were polite but distant. They complimented her voice in ways that made clear the voice was all they valued about her. One woman asked, with apparent innocence, whether Maria had attended university. She had not. The conversation moved on. Meneghini was oblivious to the snubs, or pretended to be. He talked enthusiastically about Maria's recent performances, her upcoming contracts. The aristocrats listened with the patience reserved for people who are useful but not equal. Maria watched their faces and understood that she was being tolerated, not welcomed. These people had inherited their positions. She had clawed her way up through labor. The distinction was visible in everything, her posture, her jewelry, the way she held a wine glass. She became obsessed with correcting the deficits. She hired tutors to improve her Italian, to eliminate the traces of Greek and American English that marked her speech. She studied fashion magazines and began purchasing clothes from the designers that aristocratic women wore, Bicky, later Dior. She learned which jewelers were acceptable, which restaurants were fashionable, which resorts were frequented by the right families. She constructed a wardrobe and a set of manners designed to erase her origins. The effort was expensive. Meneghini complained about the costs. A single gown could cost more than some singers earned in a month. Maria insisted the spending was necessary. If she was going to move in these circles, she needed to look the part. Meneghini relented because he wanted the social elevation too. He liked being married to a woman who was photographed at elite gatherings. It reflected well on him. He paid the bills and kept records of every purchase. By 1955, Maria was regularly attending social events in Milan, Rome, Venice. She appeared at gallery openings, charity galas, private dinners hosted by industrialists and minor nobility. She was always impeccably dressed. She had learned to modulate her voice in conversation, to laugh at the right moments, to express opinions that were informed but not challenging. She performed graciousness with the same discipline she applied to opera. But the acceptance she sought remained elusive. The aristocratic women were pleasant to her face and dismissive behind her back. Maria heard the comments secondhand, that she was nouveau, that her husband was in trade, that her fame was recent, and therefore suspect. Old money did not trust new money, and it certainly did not trust people who had earned their position through work. Maria's voice was admirable, they said, but it did not make her one of them. She encountered Princess Grace of Monaco at a reception in 1956. The princess had been Grace Kelly, an American actress before her marriage. Maria saw a version of what she wanted, an outsider who had been fully absorbed into European aristocracy through marriage. They spoke briefly. The princess was polite, charming, utterly impenetrable. Maria left the conversation feeling that she had failed some invisible test. The rejections accumulated. Maria was not invited to certain weddings, certain hunting parties, certain private gatherings where the truly elite assembled. She was acceptable for public events where her celebrity added prestige, but not for the intimate occasions that signaled genuine belonging. The distinction humiliated her. She complained to Meneghini, who told her she was being paranoid. She was famous, wealthy, admired. What more did she want? What she wanted was legitimacy that did not depend on her voice. She wanted to be valued for something other than her ability to produce sound. But everything about her life confirmed that the voice was all that mattered. When she attended parties, people wanted to talk about opera. When she met new people, they asked about her performances. When journalists interviewed her, they asked about her technique, her repertoire, her upcoming roles. No one asked about her thoughts, her interests outside singing, her inner life. She was a voice that happened to be attached to a woman. She tried to cultivate interests that would make her more than a singer. She began collecting art, attending exhibitions, purchasing paintings. But she had no training in art history, no developed taste. She bought what dealers recommended, what seemed impressive. Her collection grew, but it was arbitrary, assembled without coherence. The aristocrats who collected art seriously could see this immediately. In 1957, she was invited to a dinner at the home of a prominent Roman family. The evening included a discussion of Renaissance painting. Maria contributed a comment about a Caravaggio she had recently seen. A man across the table corrected her gently. She had misidentified the painting's subject. The conversation continued without pause. Maria said nothing else for the rest of the night. When she and Meneghini left, she told him she would never return to that house. He asked why. She did not answer. The social striving exhausted her as much as the performing. She was constantly monitoring herself, her speech, her appearance, her opinions. She could not relax at these gatherings because relaxing meant revealing the parts of herself that did not fit. Her childhood in New York, her wartime years in Athens, her mother's relentless pushing, none of it could be mentioned. She constructed a version of herself that was acceptable to these circles, and she inhabited that version so thoroughly that the original was becoming inaccessible even to her. Meneghini encouraged the performance because it served his interests. He enjoyed the proximity to wealth and status that Maria's fame provided. But he was also aware, more than Maria, that they would never be fully accepted. His own background was too provincial, too commercial. He was a brick manufacturer from Verona. No amount of money or culture could change that. He pretended not to care. But Maria suspected he cared as much as she did. They were both performing, both failing, both pretending the performance was enough. La Scala in Milan was the institution that had elevated Maria from a working soprano to an international phenomenon. Between 1951 and 1958, she sang there regularly, in productions that were designed around her voice, her presence, her increasingly specific demands. The theater's artistic director, Antonio Ghiringhelli, had initially been skeptical of her, but her performances filled the house, generated international press, and attracted donors. He tolerated her because she was profitable. The directors and conductors who worked with Maria during this period documented a pattern. In early rehearsals, she was collaborative, receptive to suggestions, willing to experiment. But as opening night approached, her anxiety intensified. She began rejecting staging choices, demanding changes to lighting, insisting that other singers adjust their positions to accommodate her sightlines. The demands were often technical. She needed to hear the orchestra differently. She needed more space to move, but they were delivered as absolute requirements. Directors learned that arguing was pointless. Maria would win or she would leave. Luchino Visconti directed her in several productions at La Scala. He was an aristocrat, a respected filmmaker, a man accustomed to controlling every element of his work. Maria was the only soprano who could challenge him and prevail. During rehearsals for La Traviata in 1955, Visconti staged a scene that required Maria to cross the stage while singing a sustained phrase. She refused. The movement disrupted her breath support. Visconti insisted the blocking was essential to the drama. Maria walked out. The rehearsal was suspended. Visconti restaged the scene. The collaboration between them was artistically extraordinary, but personally cold. Visconti saw Maria as an instrument, the greatest he had worked with, but still an instrument to be positioned and directed. Maria saw Visconti as someone who understood what she was trying to achieve dramatically, but had no real interest in her, beyond what she could deliver on stage. They created memorable productions together. Traviata, Anna Bolena, Iphigenie on Tauride, but offstage, they barely spoke. When the work was finished, they had nothing to say to each other. Leonard Bernstein conducted Maria in Medea at La Scala in 1953. Years later, he described the experience with a mixture of admiration and unease. In rehearsals, Maria had insisted on taking certain phrases slower than marked in the score, pushing the orchestra to an almost unbearable tempo. Bernstein argued that it distorted the composer's intention. Maria told him the composer was dead and she was alive. The performance went forward at her tempo. The critics called it a revelation. Bernstein never conducted her again. The pattern repeated with other conductors. Maria's musical instincts were often brilliant, but they were also inflexible. She heard the music in a specific way and could not compromise. Conductors who tried to impose traditional interpretations found themselves in confrontations they could not win. Maria had the power to have them replaced. She used it. By the mid-1950s, the pool of conductors willing to work with her was shrinking. At the Metropolitan Opera in New York, Rudolph Bing was watching these patterns with increasing concern. He had hired Maria for the 1956 to 1957 season, but the negotiations had been contentious. Maria wanted approval over directors, conductors, and supporting cast. Bing refused. The Met did not operate that way. Maria threatened to cancel. Bing called the threat. Maria backed down, but the resentment was established. During the 1956 Met season, Maria sang Norma, Tosca, and Lucia de Lammermoor. The performances were uneven. Some nights, her voice was glorious. Other nights, it was strained, the high notes forced. Bing's staff documented every vocal crack, every canceled rehearsal, every conflict with other singers. The Met was building a case, though Maria did not know it yet. The administrative machinery of major opera houses had turned its attention to Maria's reliability. Managers shared information quietly, which performances had been canceled, which rehearsals had been disrupted, which vocal problems had been observed. Maria was still a draw, still capable of selling out theaters, but she was also becoming a liability. The insurance costs for her performances were increasing. Theaters began writing penalty clauses into contracts in case she canceled. Maria felt the shift, but could not name it. She told Meneghini that people in the opera world were turning against her, that they were jealous of her success, that they wanted to see her fail. Meneghini agreed because it confirmed his narrative that Maria needed his protection. But the reality was simpler. Maria's voice was deteriorating, and the institutions that had elevated her were beginning to prepare for her decline. In 1957, she sang a series of performances of Anna Bolena at La Scala. The role was vocally punishing, requiring sustained high singing and dramatic coloratura passages. Maria's voice could still manage it, but barely. She relied on theatrical interpretation to compensate for technical limitations. The critic for Corriere della Sera praised her acting, but noted delicately that certain high passages had been interpretively adjusted. The phrase was code. Everyone in the opera world understood what it meant. After one performance, a young soprano approached Maria backstage to express admiration. Maria was gracious, thanked her, asked about her training. The girl mentioned that she was preparing Norma. Maria's expression changed. She told the girl that Norma was not a role for young singers, that it required maturity and experience that could not be learned quickly. The girl left confused by the sudden coldness. Maria turned to Meneghini and said the girl would never have the voice for Norma. What she meant was that the girl was young, that her voice was fresh, that she represented everything Maria could feel slipping away. The relationship between Maria and the institutions that had made her famous was always transactional. La Scala needed her box office draw. She needed La Scala's prestige. The Met needed her name recognition. She needed the Met's legitimacy in America. But neither side had loyalty to the other. When Maria's voice began to fail, the institutions would protect themselves. When the institutions disappointed her, Maria would retaliate. Both sides were preparing for the inevitable rupture. In private, Maria told Meneghini she wanted to retire. She was tired of the demands, the travel, the constant anxiety about her voice. Meneghini told her they could not afford it, that the investments required ongoing income. He showed her the numbers. She looked at them and agreed to the next contract. The conversation happened multiple times, always with the same outcome. Maria would continue until the decision was taken out of her hands. On January 2nd, 1958, Maria walked off the stage of the Rome Opera House during the first act of Norma. The performance was attended by the President of Italy, Giovanni Gronchi, and numerous government officials. The theater was full. Maria had sung the opening aria, Casta Diva, and part of the following scene. Then she stopped. She told the conductor she could not continue. The curtain came down. The audience sat in confused silence. After 20 minutes, an announcement was made. The performance was canceled due to the sudden illness of Madame Callas. The official explanation was that Maria had suffered from acute bronchitis and had attempted to perform despite her condition. Her doctor issued a statement confirming she had been unwell for several days. But witnesses backstage reported something different. Maria had been arguing with the theater management before the performance, complaining about the acoustics, about the temperature in the theater, about the inadequate rehearsal time. When she walked off stage, she was not coughing. She was angry. The Italian press destroyed her. Newspapers ran headlines calling her unprofessional, disrespectful to the president, a temperamental diva who had humiliated the nation. Columnists wrote editorials about artistic responsibility and the obligations performers owed to their audiences. The fact that Maria was not Italian, she was Greek-American, was mentioned frequently, often with thinly veiled suggestions that a foreign artist had insulted Italian national pride. Maria issued statements defending herself. She emphasized her illness, the medical documentation, the impossibility of continuing. But the narrative had already formed. The public wanted to believe she had walked out deliberately, that she had prioritized her ego over her duty. The truth, that her voice had been unstable for months, that she had been terrified of failing in front of the president, that stopping after one aria was preferable to collapsing vocally during the second act, was too complicated. The scandal was simpler. Meneghini tried to manage the fallout. He contacted journalists, offered interviews, threatened lawsuits against newspapers that printed particularly vicious criticisms. But he had no real power over the press. Maria's reputation was determined by editors who knew that scandal sold newspapers better than explanations. The Rome walkout became the defining story of her career in Italy, repeated endlessly, used as evidence of her character. Rudolph Bing at the Metropolitan Opera was watching. He had already been concerned about Maria's reliability. The Rome incident confirmed his suspicions. He sent a telegram to Meneghini requesting medical documentation proving Maria's illness. Meneghini responded with fury. The Met was questioning Maria's integrity, treating her like a fraud. Bing wrote back coolly. The The Met needed assurance that contracted performances would be fulfilled. If Maria could not guarantee that, the contract could be terminated. The exchange escalated. Maria, already humiliated by the Italian press, felt attacked by the Met. She wrote a letter to Bing accusing him of treating her with disrespect, of failing to understand the physical demands of singing at the highest level. Bing's response was clinical. He outlined the Met's policies regarding cancellations, the financial losses incurred, the obligations she had agreed to contractually. The letter was formal, cold, designed to create a legal record. In April 1958, Maria was scheduled to sing La Traviata at the Met. Bing wanted her to commit to additional performances of other operas the following season. Maria refused. She would only commit to one role per season, and only if she had full approval over conductor and director. Bing rejected the terms. The Met could not operate under conditions dictated by individual singers. Maria threatened to cancel Traviata. Bing told her the cancellation would result in termination of her contract and possible legal action. Maria performed Traviata. The performance was adequate, not transcendent. Her voice was tired. Critics noted the strain in the high register, the lack of tonal beauty in sustained phrases. The ovations were respectful, but not ecstatic. After the final curtain, Maria told Meneghini she would never sing at the Met again. Bing had humiliated her, treated her as replaceable. She did not need the Met or tragedies. She had La Scala, Covent Garden, the Paris Opera. Meneghini agreed, though privately, he knew that breaking with the Met was a mistake. The relationship deteriorated further. Bing scheduled a new production of Macbeth for the following season and offered the role of Lady Macbeth to another soprano without consulting Maria. She learned about it from a newspaper. She sent a telegram to Bing, calling the decision a betrayal. Bing responded that Lady Macbeth had never been discussed with her, that the Met was free to cast as it saw fit. Maria interpreted this as a public insult. Bing had chosen another singer deliberately to demonstrate that Maria was not indispensable. In November 1958, the conflict became public. A journalist asked Bing about rumors of tension with Callas. Bing responded with calculated politeness. He said the Met had the highest respect for Madame Callas's artistry, but that the institution had standards of professionalism that applied to all artists equally. The statement was designed to sound reasonable, while implying that Maria had failed to meet those standards. The press understood the subtext immediately. Maria gave an interview to Time magazine in which she described Bing as a bureaucrat who did not understand artists, who treated singers as employees rather than collaborators. She said the Met had become a factory, that it prioritized efficiency over artistic excellence. The quotes were published in full. Bing did not respond publicly, but privately, he instructed his staff to document every interaction with Maria and Meneghini. The Met was preparing to sever the relationship permanently. The Rome walkout and the conflict with Bing created a narrative that would follow Maria for the rest of her career. She was difficult, unreliable, temperamental. The narrative ignored the vocal decline that was forcing her to make impossible choices. It ignored the physical toll of the schedule she had maintained for a decade. It ignored the fact that she was terrified of failing publicly, that the walkouts and cancellations were desperate attempts to protect what remained of her voice. The public did not want context. They wanted drama. Maria began to see conspiracies. She told Meneghini that critics were being paid to write negative reviews, that theater managers were deliberately scheduling her in roles that would expose her vocal weaknesses, that other sopranos were spreading rumors to damage her reputation. Meneghini did not contradict her. The paranoia served his purposes. If Maria believed the world was hostile, she would depend on him more completely. By the end of 1958, Maria's relationship with the institutions that had made her famous was irreparably damaged. She had broken with the Met. Her standing at La Scala was uncertain. The press treated her as a spectacle rather than an artist. She was 35 years old. Aristotle Onassis first saw Maria perform in November 1957 at a gala in Venice. He attended because Elsa Maxwell, a society columnist who organized parties for wealthy people, had insisted. Onassis had no particular interest in opera. He owned a shipping empire, collected rare things, and moved through European high society with the ease of someone who had bought his way in and no longer cared what anyone thought. He watched Maria sing and decided she was worth acquiring. Maxwell arranged the introduction at a party following the performance. Onassis approached Maria with the blunt charm he used on everyone. He told her she had a magnificent voice. She thanked him politely. He asked if she and her husband would join him for dinner on his yacht, the Christina, which was docked in Monte Carlo. Maria hesitated. Meneghini, standing beside her, accepted immediately. The Christina was not a yacht in any ordinary sense. It was a floating monument to excess, a converted Canadian frigate, 300 feet long, fitted with marble bathrooms, a swimming pool whose floor could be raised to create a dance floor, bar stools covered in whale foreskin. Onassis showed guests through it with the pride of someone displaying a trophy. Maria and Meneghini arrived in Monte Carlo in June 1959 for what was supposed to be a brief dinner. They stayed for 3 weeks. Onassis was 53, short, barrel-chested, with hooded eyes and a voice roughened by cigars. He was not handsome, but he had constructed a life of such extreme luxury that proximity to it felt like power. On the Christina, everything was provided: meals prepared by French chefs, wine from Onassis's private reserves, entertainment arranged without anyone asking for it. Maria, who had spent years performing graciousness for people who barely tolerated her, found that on the yacht she was treated as the most important guest. Onassis paid attention to her in ways Meneghini had stopped doing years earlier. He asked her opinions, listened when she spoke, remembered details from previous conversations. He was not intimidated by her fame. He treated her as an equal, another person who had clawed their way up from nothing and understood what that cost. Maria, accustomed to being valued only for her voice, responded to being valued for her company. Meneghini noticed nothing, or pretended to notice nothing. He was delighted by the association with Onassis. The shipping magnate was wealthier than anyone Meneghini had ever known. Being invited onto the Christina, being included in Onassis's circle, confirmed that Maria's fame had elevated them both. He spent hours talking to Onassis about business, investments, opportunities. He did not see that Onassis was bored by him, that the conversations were a courtesy extended to access Maria. By the end of the cruise, Onassis had made his interest clear. He invited Maria and Meneghini to join him on another voyage the following month. He sent flowers to Maria's hotel room with notes that were warm but not explicitly inappropriate. He called her frequently, ostensibly to discuss plans, but actually to talk. Maria told herself it was friendship. Onassis was married to Tina Livanos, a shipping heiress. She was married to Meneghini. The boundaries were clear. In August 1959, Maria and Meneghini joined Onassis and his wife for a cruise through the Greek islands. Winston Churchill was also aboard, along with his wife and several aristocrats Onassis collected for their social value. The cruise lasted 2 weeks. During that time, Maria and Onassis were rarely apart. They spoke in Greek, which Meneghini did not understand. They stayed up late on deck after the other guests had gone to bed. Tina Onassis watched her husband with the expression of someone who had seen this before. Maria returned to Milan in September to begin rehearsals for Medea at La Scala. She was distracted, unfocused. She missed entrances during rehearsals. She argued with the conductor over tempos she had previously accepted. Meneghini asked if something was wrong. She told him she was tired. He scheduled more performances. She did not object, but she called Onassis from the telephone in their apartment when Meneghini was not home. The affair became physical in November 1959. Onassis arranged to be in Milan when Maria was performing. He stayed at the Grand Hotel. Maria met him there in the afternoons between rehearsals. Meneghini, who controlled every aspect of her schedule, somehow did not notice the gaps. Or he noticed and chose to ignore them because acknowledging the affair would mean confronting how completely his marriage had failed. By early 1960, Maria was spending more time with Onassis than with her husband. She canceled performances to join Onassis in Paris and Athens on the Christina. The cancellations damaged her reputation further. Theater managers who had tolerated her demands when she was reliable now questioned whether booking her was worth the risk. Maria did not care. For the first time in her life, she was choosing something other than her career. Onassis did not hide the affair. He was photographed with Maria at restaurants, at parties, at his homes in Paris and Athens. The press documented everything. Tina Onassis filed for divorce in June 1960. The proceedings were swift and lucrative. She received a substantial settlement and custody of their 2 children. Onassis moved on without apparent regret. Maria told Meneghini she wanted a separation. The conversation happened in their apartment in Milan in July 1960. Meneghini asked if there was someone else. Maria did not answer directly. She said the marriage had not been a real marriage for years, that they both knew it. Meneghini responded by reminding her of everything he had done for her career, the opportunities he had created, the money he had managed. Maria listened and then told him she was leaving anyway. The divorce was vicious. Meneghini demanded financial compensation for his years of managing her career. He claimed he was entitled to a portion of her future earnings. Maria's lawyers argued that Meneghini had been paid continuously through their marriage, that he had controlled all her income, that she owed him nothing. The case went to Italian courts. Meneghini gave interviews describing Maria as ungrateful, cruel, a woman who had abandoned her husband for a richer man. Maria did not respond publicly. The divorce was finalized in 1966, but Meneghini continued the legal battles for years. He sued for additional payments, for ownership of recordings, for a share of residuals. Each lawsuit was a form of punishment. Maria paid her lawyers and waited for the claims to be resolved. The process drained her financially and emotionally, but it also confirmed what she had believed for years, that Meneghini had never loved her, that the marriage had been a transaction from the beginning. In March 1960, Maria sang Norma at the Epidaurus Amphitheater in Greece. The performance was conceived as a homecoming, Callas returning to the ancient land of her training, singing in a space built 2,000 years earlier. The Greek government treated the event as a cultural milestone. Tickets sold out within hours. The audience included diplomats, aristocrats, and thousands of ordinary Greeks who had saved money to attend. Maria's voice failed in the second act. The high notes that had once soared effortlessly cracked and wavered. She pushed through, compensating with dramatic intensity, but the damage was audible. The Greek critics, who had been prepared to celebrate her, wrote reviews that were gentle but unmistakable in their assessment. The voice that had left Greece in 1945 was not the voice that had returned. Something essential had been lost. Onassis attended the performance. Afterward, he told Maria she had been magnificent. She knew he was lying. He knew nothing about opera, could not distinguish between a good performance and a failing one. His reassurance was meant kindly, but it confirmed her isolation. She was surrounded by people who either could not hear what was happening to her voice or would not tell her the truth. The vocal decline accelerated through 1960 and 1961. Maria's high register, which had once been secure up to E-flat, became unreliable above C. The middle voice retained its dark, distinctive color, but the top notes that opera demanded were increasingly precarious. She began avoiding roles that required sustained high singing. Directors and conductors adjusted productions to accommodate her limitations, lowering certain passages, cutting high notes entirely. The adjustments were presented as interpretive choices. Everyone understood they were necessities. In June 1961, Maria performed Medea at La Scala. The role sat lower than Norma or Lucia, mostly in the middle voice where she was still strong. But there were moments that required dramatic high notes, screams of rage, climactic phrases. Maria delivered them with such force that the sound was visceral, terrifying. Critics praised her theatrical genius. What they did not mention, but what everyone in the opera world knew, was that she was producing those sounds through sheer will, not technique. The voice was being destroyed in real time. She began canceling performances more frequently. In 1961, she was scheduled for 26 performances across 5 cities. She completed 14. The cancellations were attributed to illness, fatigue, vocal strain. Theater managers stopped booking her for full runs. Instead, they scheduled her for a few performances, knowing she might cancel half of them, and hired understudies who could step in with minimal notice. Onassis was rarely present for her performances. He attended opening nights when his schedule allowed, but he traveled constantly for business. Maria joined him when she could, flying to Paris, London, Athens to be with him for a few days before returning to rehearsals. The relationship was geographically unstable, held together by telephone calls and brief reunions. Maria told friends she had never been happier. The friends noticed she looked exhausted. In 1962, Maria was invited to sing at a gala celebrating President Kennedy's birthday at Madison Square Garden. The event was organized to showcase American cultural achievement. Maria was reluctant. Her relationship with American audiences had always been uneasy, but the invitation carried prestige she could not ignore. She accepted. The performance was scheduled for May. She arrived in New York in April to rehearse. The gala was a spectacle, featuring multiple performers, elaborate staging, an audience of political and cultural elites. Maria's segment was brief, two arias carefully chosen to avoid extended high singing. She rehearsed obsessively, drilling the passages until she could execute them reliably. On the night of the performance, she sang adequately. The audience applauded. The press coverage focused on Marilyn Monroe, who had sung Happy Birthday to the president earlier in the evening. Maria's contribution was mentioned briefly, respectfully, and forgotten. She returned to Europe feeling diminished. The gala had confirmed what she already suspected, that her cultural moment was passing, that younger performers were capturing attention she had once commanded. Marilyn Monroe had sung poorly, off-pitch and breathy, but no one cared because she looked extraordinary. Maria had sung well, technically competent, and no one cared because competence was expected from her. The disparity felt brutal. In November 1962, she performed Medea at Covent Garden in London. The production was critically praised, but during the final performance, Maria's voice gave out completely in the third act. She finished the scene speaking rather than singing certain phrases. The audience, assuming it was an interpretive choice, applauded enthusiastically. Backstage, Maria collapsed. A doctor was called. He examined her throat and found vocal nodules, small calluses on the vocal cords caused by strain and overuse. He recommended complete vocal rest for at least 3 months. Maria ignored the recommendation. She had performances scheduled in Dallas, Paris, and Milan. Canceling would mean admitting the voice was failing permanently. She continued singing. The nodules worsened. By early 1963, every performance was an ordeal. She relied on painkillers to suppress the physical discomfort, on tranquilizers to manage the anxiety, on stimulants to maintain energy during long performances. In May 1963, she sang her final performances of Tosca at Covent Garden. The reviews were kind, but elegiac. Critics wrote about her performances in the past tense, comparing what she had been to what she was now. One reviewer described her voice as a shadow of its former glory, yet still capable of moments of transcendent artistry. Maria read the reviews and understood they were obituaries. She told Onassis she was going to retire. He responded with distraction. He was negotiating a major shipping contract. Could they discuss it later? Maria brought it up again the following week. Onassis said she should do whatever made her happy. The indifference stung more than opposition would have. Her career, which had defined her entire life, was ending, and the man she had left her marriage for barely noticed. In July 1963, she sang Tosca at Covent Garden for what would be her final complete operatic performance. Her voice was strained throughout. The high C in Vici d'arte cracked audibly. She recovered and finished the aria, but the moment had been captured by critics, by audiences, by the institutional memory of opera. Maria Callas, the greatest soprano of her generation, had failed publicly. The recording exists. The crack is still there. She was 39 years old. Maria discovered she was pregnant in December 1963. She told Onassis in his apartment in Paris. He was 57 years old with 2 children from his previous marriage. His response was not enthusiasm, but calculation. He asked if she was certain. She said yes. He was silent for a long time. Then he told her they would discuss it after the holidays. The holidays passed. The discussion did not happen. In January 1964, Maria was 3 months pregnant. Her body was changing in ways that terrified her. She had spent years controlling her weight obsessively, and now that control was slipping. She gained weight rapidly. The pregnancy made her nauseous, exhausted. She had stopped performing, but the absence of singing created a void she did not know how to fill. Onassis was traveling constantly. She was alone in Paris, waiting. She lost the baby in March 1964. The miscarriage happened at night in Onassis's apartment. She was alone. By the time she reached the hospital, it was over. The doctor told her the pregnancy had not been viable, that these things happened. She called Onassis. He was in New York. He expressed sympathy and said he would return to Paris as soon as his business was concluded. He returned 5 days later. Onassis suggested gently that the miscarriage was perhaps for the best. Maria was nearly 41. Her career was in suspension. A child would complicate everything. Maria listened without responding. She understood what he was saying, that he had not wanted the pregnancy, that its end was convenient. She did not argue. She had learned that arguing with Onassis was pointless. He made decisions and presented them as inevitable. She became pregnant again in late 1965. This time, she told no one except Onassis. His reaction was more direct. He told her that having a child at her age was dangerous, that it would damage her health, that she needed to think practically. He did not say the word abortion, but the implication was clear. Maria said she wanted the baby. Onassis said they would discuss it. The discussion, when it happened, was brief. He told her he would not leave Tina's children to raise another family. Maria reminded him that he was already divorced from Tina. Onassis clarified. He would not marry Maria, not now, possibly not ever. If she had the child, she would be raising it alone. Maria had the abortion in January 1966. It was performed by a private doctor in Switzerland, arranged by Onassis's staff. She flew to Zurich, checked into a clinic under a false name, and underwent the procedure. Onassis did not accompany her. He sent flowers to the clinic afterward with a note expressing concern for her health. She returned to Paris 3 days later and told no one what had happened. The abortion damaged her in ways the miscarriage had not. The miscarriage had been a loss, painful but not chosen. The abortion was a capitulation. She had wanted the child. She had agreed to end the pregnancy because Onassis had made clear that keeping it would mean losing him. She had chosen him over the possibility of motherhood, and the choice felt like a final severing of something essential. Her relationship with Onassis began to shift after the abortion. He was still attentive, still generous with gifts and trips, but the underlying dynamic had changed. Maria understood that she had demonstrated she would sacrifice anything to keep him. Onassis understood it too. The balance of power, always unequal, tilted further in his favor. In 1966, Onassis began appearing in public with other women. The sightings were documented by photographers. Onassis at a nightclub in Athens with a Greek actress, Onassis at a restaurant in London with an Italian model. When Maria asked about the women, he dismissed her concerns. They were business associates, social acquaintances, nothing serious. Maria wanted to believe him. The alternative was unbearable. She tried to restart her career. In 1967, she agreed to perform in a production of Tosca in Paris. The rehearsals were difficult. Her voice, after 4 years away from opera, was even weaker than before. The high notes were unreliable. The stamina was gone. She canceled the production 2 weeks before opening night, citing illness. The press coverage was cursory. Maria Callas canceling a performance was no longer news. Onassis was spending more time in New York. He had business interests there, contacts in American politics and finance. He told Maria the trips were necessary, that she should join him when she could. But New York exhausted her. She did not know anyone there. Onassis's friends were businessmen, politicians, people who had no interest in opera. At dinners she sat silently while conversations happened around her. Onassis did not notice or did not care. In October 1968, Onassis told Maria he was going to marry Jacqueline Kennedy. He delivered the information in his apartment in Paris. Maria was sitting on the sofa. Onassis was standing. He explained that the marriage was advantageous. Kennedy's name carried immense prestige. The connection to American power was valuable. He said it did not change his feelings for Maria. They would continue their relationship. She would remain important to him. Maria absorbed the information without visible reaction. She asked when the wedding would take place. Onassis said within weeks. She asked if he loved Jacqueline Kennedy. Onassis said love was not the relevant question. The marriage was strategic. Maria asked if she was expected to accept this arrangement, to continue as his mistress while he had a wife. Onassis said he hoped she would understand. Maria stood up and left the apartment. The wedding took place on October 20th, 1968, on Onassis's private island, Scorpios. The press coverage was international, relentless. Photographs of Onassis and Jackie appeared on front pages across the world. Maria was in Paris. She did not leave her apartment for days. Friends called. She did not answer. Letters arrived. She did not open them. Onassis called 2 weeks after the wedding. He asked if they could meet. Maria agreed. They met at his apartment. He was apologetic, solicitous, concerned about her well-being. He said the marriage would not affect their relationship. She could stay at his homes when Jackie was not there. They could still travel together, still see each other. Maria listened and understood that he was offering her the position of secondary woman, the one who existed in the spaces his wife did not occupy. She agreed to the arrangement because the alternative was losing him entirely. In 1972, Giuseppe Di Stefano contacted Maria with a proposal. Di Stefano had been a celebrated tenor in the 1950s, singing frequently with Maria during her prime years. His voice, like hers, had deteriorated. He was 61 now, no longer employable by major opera houses. He suggested they tour together, a series of concerts performing scenes and arias from their most famous roles. The tour would trade on nostalgia, on audiences who wanted to hear them one more time. Maria hesitated. She had not sung publicly in nearly a decade. Di Stefano insisted it would work. They would choose repertoire carefully, avoid the most demanding passages, rely on their reputations to fill halls. Maria agreed because she had nothing else. Onassis was married to Jackie and increasingly indifferent to Maria's presence in his life. She had no career, no purpose, no structure to her days. The tour offered a temporary reprieve from the emptiness. Rehearsals began in early 1973. Immediately, it was clear that both voices were damaged beyond recovery. Di Stefano's tenor, once bright and lyrical, was harsh and unsteady. Maria's soprano retained some of its distinctive color, but almost none of its technical capability. They worked with a pianist, drilling arias, attempting to find interpretations that would disguise the vocal wreckage. The first concert was in Hamburg in October 1973. The hall was full. The audience was older, people who had heard Maria in her prime and wanted to experience her again. When she walked on stage, the applause was immediate and prolonged. She stood in the light and felt briefly that she had returned to something she understood. Then she began singing. The first aria was from Tosca. Her voice cracked on the opening phrase. She recovered, pushed through, finished. The applause was sympathetic, tinged with sadness. People were not applauding the performance. They were applauding the memory of what she had been. The reviews were devastating. Critics described the concert as painful, a spectacle of decline. One reviewer wrote that listening to Callas and Di Stefano was like watching two athletes with broken legs attempt to run a race. Another suggested that the tour was an act of cruelty, forcing audiences to witness the destruction of artists who should have preserved their legacies by remaining silent. Maria read the reviews in her hotel room. She told Di Stefano they should cancel the remaining concerts. He refused. The tour was booked. Contracts had been signed. They would continue. The tour lasted 14 months, covering cities across Europe, Asia, and the United States. Each concert was a repetition of the first, an audience arriving with hope, a performance that disappointed, applause that felt like mourning. Maria began drinking before performances, wine to calm her nerves, then vodka when wine was insufficient. Di Stefano drank too. They sat together backstage between arias, numbing themselves against what they were doing. In London, they performed at the Royal Festival Hall in November 1973. The hall was half empty. The tickets had not sold. The promoters had misjudged the demand, or audiences had heard about the earlier concerts and decided not to attend. Maria stood on stage looking at the vacant seats and understood that even nostalgia had limits. People wanted to remember her as she had been. They did not want to see what she had become. The financial arrangements for the tour were opaque. Di Stefano had organized everything, negotiating fees and contracts. Maria received payments irregularly, amounts that seemed arbitrary. She asked Di Stefano for accounting. He provided vague explanations, promises that everything would be settled at the end of the tour. Maria suspected she was being cheated, but did not pursue it. She needed the tour to continue, because stopping meant returning to Paris, to the apartment, to days with no purpose. In February 1974, they performed in Tokyo. The Japanese audiences were respectful, almost reverential. They applauded every aria regardless of quality. Maria found this worse than the European audiences, who responded honestly. The Japanese politeness felt like pity. After the Tokyo concert, she told DiStefano she could not continue. Her voice was gone. Every performance was humiliation. DiStefano reminded her that they had concerts booked through November. She asked what would happen if she canceled. He said she would be sued for breach of contract, that she would owe money she did not have. She agreed to continue. In April 1974, they performed in New York at Carnegie Hall. The tickets sold better than in Europe. American audiences were less informed about the vocal decline, or less concerned. Maria's family was in New York. Her father, George, attended the concert. He was 86, frail, living in a small apartment. Maria had not seen him in years. After the performance, he came backstage. He told her she had sung beautifully. She knew he was lying, that his hearing was too poor to judge. But the kindness broke something in her. She cried in the dressing room after he left. The tour ended in Sapporo, Japan, in November 1974. The final concert was sparsely attended. Maria and DiStefano performed the program mechanically, without energy or emotion. When the last aria finished, the applause was brief. They left the stage. There was no curtain call, no encore. In the dressing room, DiStefano opened a bottle of champagne. He toasted their success, the audiences they had reached, the money they had earned. Maria did not drink. She changed clothes and returned to her hotel. The financial settlement came months later. DiStefano's accountants provided a breakdown of expenses: travel, hotels, rehearsal pianists, promotional costs. After deductions, Maria's share was substantially less than she had expected. She hired a lawyer to review the documents. The lawyer found irregularities, probable fraud, but pursuing legal action would be expensive and uncertain. Maria dropped it. She had earned enough to live on for a few years if she was careful. That was sufficient. The tour left her with nothing except confirmation that her career was irretrievably finished. The audiences who had attended had not come to hear her sing. They had come to witness the ruin of someone who had once been extraordinary. Maria understood the distinction. She had participated in her own diminishment, toured the world displaying her failure for money. The decision had been practical, even necessary, but it could not be undone. She returned to Paris in December 1974. The apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel was dark and cold. She had been gone for more than a year. The furniture was covered in dust. She opened the curtains and looked out at the street. Nothing had changed. She had traveled the world, performed in a dozen cities, and returned to exactly where she had been. Alone. Maria's days in Paris followed a pattern that calcified into ritual. She woke late, usually after noon, because she could not sleep at night without pills, and the pills left her sedated into the next day. The housekeeper, Bruna, arrived at 10 and moved quietly through the apartment. Cleaning rooms Maria no longer entered. The bedroom, the bathroom, the sitting room where Maria spent most of her time. These were the only spaces that showed signs of use. Breakfast, when Maria ate it, consisted of coffee and sometimes fruit. She had lost weight again, not through discipline, but through disinterest in food. Her body, which had been heavy in her 20s and thin in her 30s, was now gaunt. Her clothes hung loosely. She wore the same few outfits repeatedly. Comfortable things, robes and loose dresses, nothing that required effort. The designer gowns she had purchased in the 1950s remained in closets, untouched. The mail arrived daily. Bruna sorted it into piles: bills, which were sent to Maria's lawyer, fan letters, which accumulated unread, invitations to galas and events, which Maria declined without opening. Occasionally there were letters from journalists requesting interviews. Maria instructed Bruna to discard them. She had stopped giving interviews after the tour with DiStefano. There was nothing left to say. The telephone rang several times a day. Maria rarely answered. The calls were from people she did not want to speak to, promoters suggesting concert opportunities, former colleagues asking for favors, acquaintances from her performing years who wanted to maintain connections she no longer valued. The answering machine recorded messages. Maria listened to them later sometimes if she was bored enough. Most she erased without listening. The pills were stored in the bathroom cabinet. Nembutal for sleep, Valium for anxiety, Dexedrine when she needed energy, codeine for pain that had become chronic, her back, her joints, headaches that lasted days. The prescriptions came from different doctors. Maria saw them rarely, just often enough to renew the medications. The doctors asked perfunctory questions about her health. Maria provided perfunctory answers. Everyone understood the transaction. She took the first pills around 2 in the afternoon, Valium to manage the anxiety that started building as soon as she was fully awake. The anxiety had no specific object. It was generalized, a constant low hum of dread. The Valium softened it, created a buffer between Maria and the emptiness of her days. By 3, she was calm enough to function. The afternoons were spent listening to recordings. Maria had a collection of her own performances, recordings made at La Scala, at Covent Garden, at the Met. She played them on a record player in the sitting room, sitting on the sofa, eyes closed, listening to the voice she no longer had. The recordings were from the 1950s when her voice was at its peak. She knew every phrase, every breath, every slight imperfection. She listened to them not for pleasure, but for evidence that she had once been what people said she was. Sometimes she cried while listening. The crying was not dramatic, not the operatic weeping she had performed on stage thousands of times. It was quiet, tears running down her face while she sat motionless. Bruna heard it occasionally from the kitchen. She did not intervene. Maria had made clear that she did not want comfort. Onassis called occasionally, less frequently after his marriage to Jackie. The calls were brief, affectionate in a distant way. He asked how she was. She said she was fine. He told her about his business, his travels, his children. She listened and said little. Sometimes he suggested she visit him, at his apartment in Paris when Jackie was not there, or at his home in Athens. Maria agreed, and then did not go. The effort of leaving the apartment had become overwhelming. In 1975, Onassis fell ill. He had been experiencing abdominal pain for months. The doctors diagnosed myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Maria heard about it through mutual acquaintances. She called his office, left messages that were not returned. In March 1975, Onassis died in Paris. He was 69 years old. Maria learned of his death from a news report on the radio. She attended the funeral on Scorpios, arriving late, standing at the back of the crowd. Jackie was there, veiled, surrounded by family and security. Maria wore dark glasses and a black coat. No one spoke to her. After the service, she returned to Paris immediately. She did not speak at the funeral, did not approach Jackie, did not visit the grave afterward. She had come to confirm that he was dead, that the relationship was finally irreversibly over. The will was read weeks later. Onassis had left the bulk of his fortune to his daughter, Christina, with provisions for Jackie and his son, Alexander, who had died in a plane crash in 1973. Maria was not mentioned. She had expected nothing, but the absence was formal, documented. He had erased her from his legacy as thoroughly as if she had never existed in his life. After Onassis's death, Maria's routine did not change. She still woke late, still took the pills, still listened to the recordings. But the days felt heavier. While Onassis was alive, even at a distance, even married to someone else, Maria had maintained the fiction that he might return to her, that the relationship might resume in some form. His death eliminated that possibility. She was 41 when they met. She was 51 when he died. She had spent a decade waiting. The evenings were the worst. By 7 or 8, the Valium from the afternoon was wearing off. The anxiety returned, intensified. Maria took more pills. Another Valium, sometimes 2, Nembutal if she wanted to sleep early. The pills did not remove the anxiety. They only made it tolerable. She sat in the dim light of the sitting room, the record player silent, and waited for the medication to pull her under. Bruna left at 6 each evening. After she was gone, the apartment was silent except for the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Maria had no visitors. Friends from her performing years had stopped calling after being declined repeatedly. Her sister Jackie lived in America and wrote letters Maria did not answer. Her father had died in 1972. Her mother, Evangelia, was still alive somewhere in Greece. They had not spoken in more than 20 years. Sleep came late after midnight, aided by the Nembutal. Maria lay in bed waiting for unconsciousness. Sometimes it came quickly. Other nights, she lay awake for hours, despite the pills, her mind cycling through memories. Performances, mistakes, conversations with Onassis, the abortion, the miscarriage, decisions that had seemed necessary at the time and now felt like a sequence of surrenders. In the months after Onassis's death, Maria began to construct a revision of their relationship that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. She told the few people she still spoke to that Onassis had loved her until the end, that the marriage to Jackie had been a business arrangement that never diminished what he felt for Maria. She described phone calls that may not have happened, promises he had supposedly made, plans for them to be together after his business affairs were settled. The delusion was not complete madness. It was a form of survival. If Maria accepted the truth that Onassis had used her, replaced her, and died without thinking of her, she would have to confront the fact that she had wasted a decade on a relationship that had never been what she believed it was. The alternative narrative, the one where Onassis had truly loved her, allowed her to preserve meaning in the suffering. She began telling people that Onassis had left provisions for her in his will. The claim was false, but Maria repeated it with enough conviction that some believed her. She said there were properties, investments, arrangements that had been made privately. When no such provisions materialized, she blamed Onassis's lawyers, his family, the complicated nature of international estates. The explanations became increasingly elaborate. No one challenged her directly. In 1976, a producer approached Maria with a proposal for a film about her life. The project would be a documentary featuring interviews with Maria, archival footage of her performances, commentary from critics and colleagues. Maria agreed to participate. She needed the money, but more than that, she needed the validation. The film would confirm that her life had mattered, that her career had been significant. The interviews were conducted in her apartment over several weeks. Maria sat in the sitting room, carefully dressed, hairstyled, makeup applied to hide the gauntness in her face. She spoke about her childhood, her training, her years at La Scala. She described her artistic philosophy, her approach to roles, her commitment to authenticity. She did not mention the pills, the weight loss that had damaged her voice, the performances she had canceled, the abortion. The version of herself she presented to the camera was edited, sanitized. When the interviewer asked about Onassis, Maria became animated. She described him as the great love of her life, a man who understood her in ways no one else had. She said they had been planning to marry, that only his sudden death had prevented it. The interviewer did not correct her. The footage was recorded and filed. The documentary was never completed. Funding collapsed months later. The interviews remained in an archive, unedited. Maria began attending social events again in late 1976. The invitations came from people who remembered her, who wanted the prestige of having Maria Callas at their parties. She accepted occasionally, motivated by boredom more than desire. She would arrive late, stay briefly, speak to almost no one. At one party in Paris, a young soprano approached her with nervous admiration. The girl said she had studied Maria's recordings, that Maria was her greatest influence. Maria looked at her and said, "Then you have made a terrible mistake." The girl retreated, confused. Maria left the party immediately after. She hired a voice teacher in early 1977, a man who had worked with elderly singers attempting to recover vocal function. Maria told him she wanted to explore the possibility of performing again. They began lessons in her apartment. Within minutes, the teacher understood that her voice was beyond recovery. The vocal cords had been damaged by years of strain, pharmaceutical use, and neglect. What remained was a shadow, some tone, some control, but nothing that could sustain a performance. Maria insisted on continuing the lessons anyway. Twice a week, the teacher arrived and guided her through exercises, breathing, scales, simple areas. Maria worked with the focus she had brought to her training in the 1940s, as if discipline alone could rebuild what time had destroyed. After 8 weeks, the teacher suggested gently that they stop. Continuing was pointless and potentially harmful. Maria dismissed him. She did not resume the lessons, but she did not accept his assessment either. She began corresponding with Christina Onassis, Aristotle's daughter, who had inherited the bulk of his fortune. Maria's letters were friendly, nostalgic, written as if she and Christina had a relationship they did not actually have. She reminisced about times on the Christina, about Aristotle's generosity, about how much she missed him. Christina's responses were polite but brief. She did not encourage the correspondence. Maria continued writing anyway. In April 1977, Maria asked her lawyer to investigate whether she had any legal claim to Onassis's estate. The lawyer reviewed the situation and reported that she had no claim. She had not been married to Onassis, was not mentioned in his will, and had no documentation of promises he had made. Maria insisted there must be something, some provision that had been overlooked. The lawyer repeated that there was nothing. Maria fired him and hired a different lawyer, who told her the same thing. The delusion about Onassis's provisions persisted through the summer of 1977. Maria mentioned it to Bruna, to the few acquaintances who still called, to her sister in letters she wrote but did not send. The story changed in small ways. Sometimes the provision was a house in Greece, sometimes it was a trust fund, sometimes it was shares in the shipping company. The inconsistencies did not trouble her. The belief that Onassis had cared enough to provide for her was more important than factual accuracy. She stopped leaving the apartment entirely by August. Bruna did all the shopping, all the errands. Maria's world contracted to a few rooms, the bedroom, the bathroom, the sitting room with the record player. She spent hours staring out the window at the street below, watching people who had places to go, purposes that structured their days. She could not imagine what those purposes felt like anymore. The phone rang less frequently. The invitations stopped arriving. The few people who had maintained contact drifted away, tired of calling and receiving no answer, tired of visiting and being turned away at the door. Maria had not deliberately cut herself off from the world. She had simply stopped participating, and the world had continued without her. By September, she was speaking to no one except Bruna, and those conversations were perfunctory. Instructions about meals, complaints about minor discomforts, questions about whether any mail had arrived. Bruna worried, but said nothing. Maria had made clear years ago that concern was unwelcome. The only thing Maria wanted was to be left alone, and that was the one thing everyone was willing to give her. Bruna Lupoli had worked for Maria since 1974, hired after the disastrous tour with Di Stefano. She was a middle-aged Italian woman, competent and discreet, accustomed to working for wealthy people who treated household staff as furniture. Maria was different. She was not imperious or demanding in the way Bruna had expected. She was simply absent, emotionally vacant, moving through the apartment like someone visiting a place she no longer recognized. The job was not difficult. Maria required little. Bruna arrived each morning at 10, cleaned the rooms that needed cleaning, prepared a light lunch that Maria rarely ate, and left at 6. The salary was adequate. Maria paid on time through her lawyer and never questioned expenses, but the work was depressing. Bruna was maintaining an apartment for a woman who had stopped living in any meaningful sense. In the 2 years Bruna had worked there, Maria had received perhaps a dozen visitors. Most were business associates, her lawyer, her accountant. Occasionally a journalist who had convinced someone to arrange an introduction. The visits were brief, conducted in the sitting room, with Bruna instructed to bring coffee and then leave. Maria spoke to these visitors with mechanical politeness, answering questions without elaboration, offering nothing personal. Bruna noticed the pills immediately. The bathroom cabinet was filled with prescription bottles, some current, others expired. Maria took them throughout the day, without apparent system. Bruna had worked for people with pharmaceutical dependencies before, but Maria's consumption was extreme. Some days she seemed heavily sedated, moving slowly, speech slightly slurred. Other days she was agitated, pacing the apartment, unable to sit still. The apartment itself was elegant but lifeless. The furniture was expensive. Italian mid-century pieces upholstered in rich fabrics. The walls held paintings Maria had purchased in the 1950s and 1960s, works by artists Bruna did not recognize. But the space felt like a museum, not a home. Nothing was out of place. There were no books lying open, no personal objects that suggested current engagement with life. The apartment was maintained but not inhabited. Maria's routine was fixed. She woke late, took pills, drank coffee, listened to records. The records were always recordings of herself, performances from decades earlier. Bruna could hear them from the kitchen while she worked, Maria's voice, younger and powerful, filling the silent apartment. Sometimes Bruna heard Maria crying. She never acknowledged it, and Bruna pretended not to notice. The telephone was a source of anxiety for Maria. It rang several times a day, and Maria almost never answered. She would sit on the sofa, staring at the phone while it rang, waiting for the answering machine to capture the call. Later, she would listen to the messages, sometimes calling back, more often not. Bruna understood that Maria was afraid of the phone, though she could not have explained what Maria feared. Meals were a negotiation. Bruna prepared lunch each day, simple things, salads, light pasta, fruit. Maria picked at the food, eating a few bites before pushing the plate away. Bruna tried varying the menu, thinking perhaps Maria was bored with the offerings. Nothing worked. Maria simply did not want to eat. Her weight dropped steadily. By the summer of 1977, her clothes hung on her frame. Bruna mentioned it once, suggesting that Maria might want to see a doctor. Maria said she was fine, and the subject was closed. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. Maria slept in one. The other was closed, the door always shut. Bruna was instructed never to enter it. Once, when Maria was out, a rare occurrence by 1977, Bruna opened the door out of curiosity. The room was filled with luggage, dozens of suitcases and trunks, all closed. Bruna did not open any of them. She closed the door and never mentioned it. Later, she wondered if the suitcases contained Maria's costumes, her gowns, the physical remnants of her performing life, packed away and preserved like artifacts. In the final months, Maria stopped bathing regularly. Bruna noticed the smell first, not overwhelming, but present, the smell of someone who had not washed in days. Bruna suggested running a bath. Maria said she would do it later. Later never came. Bruna began to understand that Maria was not simply depressed or anxious. She was deteriorating, losing the capacity to perform basic self-care. The sitting room, where Maria spent most of her time, had a large window overlooking Avenue Georges Mandel. Maria sat there for hours, staring out at the street. Bruna asked once what she was looking at. Maria did not answer. Bruna learned not to ask questions. Maria tolerated her presence, but did not want interaction. In August 1977, a package arrived. A box of letters Maria had written years earlier, returned by someone clearing out old correspondence. Bruna brought the box to Maria. She opened it, looked at the letters briefly, and told Bruna to throw them away. Bruna asked if she was certain. Maria said yes. Bruna placed the box in the trash. Later she retrieved it, thinking perhaps Maria had made the decision impulsively and would regret it. She stored the box in a closet. Maria never asked about it. The pharmacy deliveries came weekly. Bruna received them at the door, bags filled with pill bottles more than seemed medically justifiable. Bruna did not question it. She placed the bags in the bathroom and said nothing. The accumulation of bottles in the cabinet grew. Some were half empty, some untouched. Maria took what she wanted without system, guided by need rather than prescription. By September, Bruna began to fear that Maria would die. Not imminently, not in a way that required immediate intervention, but eventually, inevitably, as a consequence of how she was living. The isolation, the pills, the refusal to eat. It was a slow form of self-destruction. Bruna considered calling someone, Maria's lawyer perhaps, but she did not know what she would say. Maria was not actively suicidal. She was simply allowing herself to disintegrate. On September 15, 1977, Maria seemed more tired than usual. She took her pills in the afternoon, sat on the sofa listening to recordings, and did not speak when Bruna brought her coffee. Bruna asked if she needed anything. Maria shook her head. At 6, Bruna left as she always did, locking the door behind her. She would return the next morning at 10. She did not know, as she walked down the stairs and into the Paris evening, that Maria would be dead before she returned. No one knew. Maria had given no indication, made no final statements. She was simply tired, and the tiredness had become total. Maria woke on the morning of September 16th with no awareness that it was her last day. She opened her eyes sometime after 11, later than usual. The apartment was silent. Bruna had not yet arrived. The curtains were drawn, filtering the late morning light into a dim gray. Maria lay in bed without moving, waiting for the accumulated sedatives from the previous night to release their grip. The routine began as it always did. She rose slowly, her body stiff and uncooperative. She walked to the bathroom, the floor cold under her bare feet. The mirror reflected a face she had stopped examining closely. Gaunt, the skin loose, eyes that seemed too large for the narrowed face. She did not look at herself. She opened the medicine cabinet. The pills were arranged without order. Nembutal, Valium, codeine, others. She selected the Valium first, 2 tablets, dry swallowed. Then the Nembutal, 1 capsule, though it was morning, and Nembutal was meant for sleep. She had stopped distinguishing between what the pills were supposed to do and what she needed them to do. They all served the same function now, distance from herself. In the kitchen, she made coffee. The motion was automatic, performed without thought. She had made coffee in this kitchen thousands of times, standing in the same position, using the same cup. The coffee brewed. She poured it, added nothing, and carried it to the sitting room. She sat on the sofa in the same place she always sat, the cushion permanently compressed from years of her weight. Bruna arrived at 10, as scheduled. She let herself in with her key, called a greeting. Maria responded quietly. Bruna moved through the apartment, beginning her work in the rooms Maria was not using. The sounds were familiar: water running, the vacuum in the bedroom, drawers opening and closing. Maria sat with her coffee, listening to the sounds of someone else maintaining her life. Bruna brought her a small plate of fruit around noon. Maria looked at it, thanked her, did not eat. Bruna said nothing. She had learned that insisting was pointless. She returned to the kitchen. Maria sat with the untouched plate beside her. The fruit would sit there until evening, when Bruna would remove it, uneaten, as she removed the uneaten fruit every day. The mail arrived in the early afternoon. Bruna sorted it at the kitchen table. Bills for the lawyer, advertisements to discard, a letter from someone Maria did not know. Nothing that required Maria's attention. Bruna placed the lawyer's mail in an envelope to be sent out. The rest went in the trash. Maria did not ask about it. At 2, Maria took more pills. The Valium from the morning had created a baseline numbness, but the anxiety was building underneath it. She took another Valium, then a codeine for the headache that had been present since waking. The combination made her drowsy. She considered lying down, but did not. She remained on the sofa, her body sinking deeper into the cushions. The telephone rang at 3. Maria did not answer. The answering machine recorded a message, a journalist requesting an interview for an article about opera in the 1950s. The voice was polite, respectful, certain that Maria would be honored to participate. Maria listened to the message after it finished recording. She did not call back. She erased the tape. Bruna left at 6. She asked Maria if she needed anything before she went. Maria said no. Bruna reminded her that she would return tomorrow morning at 10. Maria nodded. Bruna locked the door as she left. The apartment became silent except for the ambient sounds of the building, pipes, distant traffic, the structure settling. Maria sat in the dimming light. She did not turn on the lamps. The sitting room grew darker as the sun set. She remained on the sofa, unmoving. At some point, she became aware that she was thirsty, but did not get up to get water. The effort required to stand, to walk to the kitchen, to fill a glass. It was too much. She stayed where she was. At 8, she took more pills. The exact sequence is unclear. The autopsy would later find evidence of barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and other sedatives in her system, but the timing of ingestion could not be determined precisely. Maria took them because that was what she did in the evenings. The pills were the structure of her day, the only reliable rhythm. She felt tired, not the normal tiredness that came from exertion, but a deeper exhaustion, the kind that suggested her body was shutting down rather than preparing for rest. She considered going to bed but remained on the sofa. Moving required a decision, and decisions had become difficult. It was easier to stay where she was. At some point, the exact time could not be determined, Maria's heart stopped functioning properly. The medical explanation would involve terms like myocardial infarction, acute heart failure, probable contributing factors, including chronic pharmaceutical use and poor nutrition. But the technical language could not capture what happened, which was simply that her body, after years of abuse and neglect, stopped working. She may have felt chest pain. She may have been unconscious before the crisis occurred. The pills in her system made it unlikely she experienced significant suffering. Her body was found in the bedroom, on the floor beside the bed, still wearing the clothing from the previous day. At some point, after sitting on the sofa, she had moved to the bedroom. She had not changed clothes. She had not prepared for sleep. She had simply walked to the bedroom and collapsed. The exact time of death was estimated to be between 11 at night on September 16th and 2 in the morning on September 17th. Maria died alone on the floor of her bedroom, in an apartment where no one would find her until Bruna arrived the following morning. There was no phone call for help, no final statement, no awareness that this was the end. The apartment remained silent through the night. The body lay where it had fallen. The pills sat in their bottles in the bathroom cabinet. The untouched fruit sat on the plate in the sitting room. The recordings were stacked beside the record player. Everything remained exactly as Maria had left it, waiting for someone to arrive and discover that she was gone. Bruna found her at 10 the next morning. She used her key, called Maria's name, received no answer. She walked through the apartment and saw Maria's body on the bedroom floor. She called an ambulance. The paramedics confirmed what was already obvious. Maria Callas was dead. She was 53 years old. The autopsy was performed at the Hôpital Fernand Vidal in Paris on September 17th. The pathologist recorded the official cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, heart attack. But the report noted contributing factors: severe weight loss, pharmaceutical toxicity, evidence of long-term barbiturate and benzodiazepine use. The heart itself showed signs of chronic strain. Maria's body had been failing for years. The heart attack was simply the moment when the accumulated damage became fatal. The news reached the press within hours. By the afternoon of September 17th, newspapers across Europe and America were running obituaries. The headlines called her La Divina, the greatest soprano of the 20th century, the voice that defined an era. The articles recounted her triumphs: La Scala, Covent Garden, the recordings that had preserved her interpretations. Some mentioned the difficulties: the Rome walkout, the conflicts with Rudolf Bing, the vocal decline. Almost all mentioned Onassis, framing her life as a tragic love story. The woman who died alone on a bedroom floor was transformed immediately into legend. Her family surfaced with unexpected speed. Maria's mother, Evangelia, whom Maria had not spoken to in more than 25 years, issued a statement from Athens expressing grief and claiming that Maria had been planning to visit her. The claim was false. Maria's sister Jackie flew to Paris from New York. She had written letters to Maria over the years, most of which Maria had not answered. Now she appeared to manage the funeral arrangements and, more pressingly, the estate. Maria had left no will. The absence was not oversight, but paralysis. She had been encouraged by lawyers to draft a will multiple times. She had refused, unable to make decisions about money, property, or legacy. The refusal meant that her estate, the apartment, her possessions, her royalties from recordings, would be distributed according to French inheritance law. Her closest living relatives were her mother and her sister. They would divide everything. The funeral was held at the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Paris on September 20th. The service was attended by several hundred people: opera administrators, former colleagues, society figures who had known her in the 1950s and 1960s. Rudolf Bing attended. Giuseppe Di Stefano attended. Leonard Bernstein sent a telegram expressing condolences. Jackie Kennedy Onassis did not attend. She sent flowers with a card that read simply, "With sympathy." Maria's body was cremated, per instructions she had given years earlier in a conversation with her lawyer. But no instructions had been left about what to do with the ashes. Her mother wanted them interred in Athens, in the family plot where Maria's father was buried. Her sister wanted them kept in Paris, where Maria had spent her final years. The disagreement escalated into a legal dispute that lasted months. While the family argued, Maria's ashes remained at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, stored in an administrative office, unclaimed. The indignity was noted by the press. Articles appeared questioning why the ashes of one of the century's greatest artists were sitting in bureaucratic limbo. The Greek government offered to resolve the issue by interring the ashes at the First Cemetery of Athens with full state honors. Evangelia supported this. Jackie opposed it. The dispute continued. The apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel was emptied in October. Jackie supervised the process, hiring an estate sale company to catalog and sell Maria's possessions. The furniture, the paintings, the designer gowns from the 1950s, everything was inventoried and assigned value. The pills in the bathroom cabinet were discarded. The recordings Maria had listened to obsessively were packed into boxes. The suitcases in the closed bedroom, filled with costumes and memorabilia from her performing years, were opened and assessed. The auction was held in December 1977. Collectors and opera enthusiasts bid on Maria's possessions: a bicky gown she had worn in Traviata, jewelry purchased during her years with Onassis, letters from conductors and directors. The items sold for substantial sums, far more than their material value. People were buying fragments of the legend, physical objects they could connect to the mythology of Maria Callas. The proceeds went to her mother and sister. Neither attended the auction. The legal battle over the ashes was resolved in 1978. A French court determined that the ashes would be scattered at sea, a compromise that prevented either side from claiming complete victory. But the scattering did not happen immediately. The ashes remained at Père Lachaise for another year, awaiting bureaucratic clearance. In 1979, 2 years after Maria's death, her ashes were finally scattered in the Aegean Sea off the coast of Greece. No ceremony was held. A court-appointed official performed the task without witnesses. Evangelia died in 1982, 5 years after Maria. She had given numerous interviews in those years, selling stories about Maria's childhood, her training, their relationship. The stories were self-serving, often fabricated, designed to present Evangelia as a devoted mother who had been cruelly abandoned. The interviews earned her money, which she spent quickly. She died in poverty in Athens. Her obituary mentioned that she was the mother of Maria Callas. That was the only reason anyone noted her death. The recordings became Maria's primary legacy. Her performances, captured on vinyl and tape, were reissued repeatedly. Record companies marketed them as definitive interpretations, essential listening. New generations of singers studied her recordings, analyzing her technique, her phrasing, her dramatic choices. The recordings preserved what the live performances had not: a version of Maria Callas that could be experienced without the context of her decline, her cancellations, her conflicts. The recordings were pristine, permanent, divorced from the messy reality of the woman who had made them. In 1987, 10 years after her death, a museum dedicated to Maria Callas opened in Milan. The collection included her costumes, her scores, photographs from her performances, letters and personal documents purchased from her estate. The museum presented Maria's life as a triumph, a woman who had overcome poverty and hardship to become the greatest soprano of her generation. The pharmaceutical dependency, the abortions, the isolation of her final years were mentioned briefly, if at all. The museum was a shrine to the legend, not the life. The estate continued generating income through the 1980s and 1990s, royalties from recordings, licensing fees for documentary footage, sales of photographs and memorabilia. All of it produced revenue that was distributed to Maria's heirs and eventually to charitable foundations established in her name. The foundations funded music education, scholarships for young singers, opera productions. Maria's wealth, which she had barely touched in her final years, was being used to perpetuate the art form that had consumed her. The mythology of Maria Callas solidified over the decades following her death. She became La Divina, the untouchable genius, the artist who had sacrificed everything for her art. The reality? That she had been profoundly unhappy, that her career had ended in humiliation, that she had died alone and largely forgotten, was subsumed into a narrative of tragic grandeur. The recordings remain. They sit in archives, in collections, on streaming platforms where anyone can access them. Maria Callas singing Norma in 1954, Tosca in 1953, Lucia in 1955. The voice is there, preserved, separated from the woman who produced it. Listeners hear the sound and construct their own understanding of what it meant, what it cost, whether it was worth it. The question of whether Maria Callas was destroyed by her talent or by the people who exploited it cannot be answered cleanly. Both are true. Neither is sufficient. She was destroyed by her mother's ambition, by Meneghini's control, by Onassis's indifference, by the institutions that discarded her. when she became unreliable. But she was also complicit in her own destruction. The starvation, the pills, the inability to imagine a life that was not structured around performance and approval. What remains unclear is whether there was ever a self beneath the performance, a Maria Callas who existed independently of the roles she inhabited and the expectations imposed on her. The evidence suggests there was not. From childhood, she had been trained to be an instrument. The training succeeded so completely that when the instrument failed, nothing else remained. The museums and tributes and reissued recordings present a version of her life that is coherent, meaningful, tragic, in a way that feels purposeful. The reality was smaller and more desolate, a woman sitting alone in a Paris apartment, listening to recordings of herself, taking pills to manage the emptiness, waiting for a phone call that never came. The performances that made her immortal were finished decades before she died. The years between were just waiting. Wealth bought her nothing that mattered. Fame gave her recognition, but not belonging. Love, when it came, was conditional and temporary. The voice that was supposed to justify everything deteriorated until it could not justify anything. And in the end, she died the way she had lived most of her life, alone, performing for no one, in a silence that no applause could penetrate. The ashes were scattered in the Aegean. The recordings remain. The distance between those two facts is where Maria Callas actually lived.